Hello, and welcome to the next episode of Contra Costa Chats with County Supervisor John Gioia. This is where Contra Costa County comes together to talk about the important public issues of the day. I'm Robert Rogers. I'm on staff for County Supervisor John Gioia, and I'm here with County Supervisor Gioia today.
Robert, good to have this discussion. I'm enjoying these.
Thanks so much. It's great to be with you. Today, the issue, unfortunately, is not a pretty one, Supervisor Gioia. We're talking about the Antioch police text message scandal. A lot of people already know about this. The brief version is that a federal investigation uncovered text messages being exchanged between Antioch police officers in which disgusting, racist, homophobic, and sexist and other violent imagery was being exchanged in text messages by these officers. This has created a furor in our community, and it is something that has to be addressed. I really want to talk about this with you, County Supervisor Gioia, because you have been an anti-racist since day one. You fought hard for equity in our community, and this is really hitting you both personally and on a policy level. Talk a little bit, if you could, about what you think about this revelation and the kinds of things that you're leading at Contra Costa County to address this.
Yes, it was, I think, shocking to many residents, but at the same time, not surprising. I think what was most shocking was that this pattern existed among nearly one half of the police officers in Antioch. I think we all know that there's racism out there in the justice system, including among police officers, but the extent of these racist texts, I think, caught a lot of people off guard, and they were especially shocked by that. And a number of us, including at the Board of Supervisors meeting, have condemned this, spoken out against it, and really declared our desire to not just call this out, but to work to correct the harms that have occurred and are occurring from the behavior of these officers. And by that I mean how these officers, their work, their investigations, their charging of residents was impacted by their racism and the need to investigate those cases to fix the harm. And what's especially, I think, disturbing is we really hold our law enforcement officers to the highest trust and the highest standards. And when we see something like this happen, it causes the public to lose trust in the system that is set up to protect all residents equally. And clearly, if you're an African-American resident of Antioch, you are questioning the motives, the intent of your police department, and we can't have that. But as I said, in addition to criticizing it and calling it out, we do need to take proactive steps to correct the harms. And we did that in several ways. We, in our budget hearing, approved about $2.2 million to increase the number of lawyers in both our district attorney's office and our public defender's office to investigate the hundreds, if not thousands, of cases over many years, over a period of many years, that could have been impacted by the racism of these officers. In fact, there's already been one such case that a court has thrown out because of this. There is a law in California, relatively recent, called the Racial Justice Act, that actually requires public defenders and district attorneys to review cases where racial bias could have impacted how that case was handled. So that's the first thing we did. We owe it to people who could have been impacted and therefore harmed by these particular officers. But we know this goes on in many places. And one of the things we're also doing is establishing an Office of Racial Equity and Social Justice, a proposal that Supervisor Glover and I took to our board a couple of years ago, to establish an office that would look both within the county and working with other agencies about how our county systems really work hard to correct and stop racism, including institutional racism that happens within our own institutions of government. I think we can't forget that racism has been institutionalized in this country, and that while individuals themselves can be racist, institutions can as well, and that the harms of those institutions are long-lasting. So this office that we're establishing, we're in the process now of starting outreach for 2 co-directors to run this office. And what we did differently than anywhere else is, rather than have the Board of Supervisors really lay down how this office should be established, we actually looked to the community. We worked with a community-led committee to do extensive outreach and listening sessions around the county over about 18 months to hear from the public what do they want to see in this type of office. What should the priorities be of an office of racial equity and social justice? And while race is a primary issue to first address, there are others. There would be discrimination by not just race, but ethnicity, sexual orientation, immigration status, language, disability, socioeconomic status, gender. So this office eventually, when established, will address all of those issues, both among county departments. The idea is to expand significantly the work that we're already doing on fighting racism and discrimination. And we did actually, a couple of years ago, declare racism a public health issue, working with our health department, because it affects people's health profoundly. Our health department has already hired an equity officer. In fact, that equity officer worked during the pandemic to develop strategies so that our African American and Spanish-speaking Latina communities were tested and vaccinated at an equal rate to the white community, because we had a gap. We had an equity gap, a disparity gap, where African Americans and Latinos were not vaccinated as a higher rate as non-Latino whites. And our equity officer worked with community to develop strategies, a good example of that. I think another thing we have focused on is addressing, this gets back to the Antioch situation, racism and discrimination in our justice system. And a few years ago, we established an office, or not office, but we established a racial justice task force that made numerous recommendations to the Board of Supervisors about how to really eliminate the disparity between whites and African Americans in terms of prosecution and incarceration in our justice system. That group is now called the Racial Justice Oversight Body. It includes both residents as well as county departments, and they've been very, very strong about identifying strategies that we need to implement to make our justice system not just colorblind, but anti-racist.
That's tremendous, and I want to get more into that. It's so exciting to see leadership at the public service level addressing these issues and being proactive about it. I want to come back to that, but before I do, I also want to mention, and I know our listeners are very smart, very savvy. They get this, but it bears repeating. You know, this terrible situation in Antioch, this erodes trust in law enforcement institutions, and that's so sad, so unfortunate, in part because we know the vast majority of the men and women in law enforcement in our county, in cities, and the county level are consummate professionals who are working towards equity as well. And I wanted to give you a little bit of space to talk about that, if you could.
Yeah, I think we do need to recognize that most of our law enforcement officers, overwhelmingly, are individuals with integrity who work to protect all of us. But when we get examples like what we're seeing in Antioch, where it's nearly half the force, I think that's especially egregious, where we need to especially call it out. And it does harm those majority of hardworking officers, men and women, who work to protect the community. So I want to acknowledge that. And I've heard extensive criticism from others in law enforcement to the actions of these particular officers in Antioch, because they know that the action of these officers hurts them, hurts their credibility, hurts their trust, and they don't want that to happen. I know I've talked to Richmond police officers who value their partnership with the community and feel that the actions in Antioch hurt them. I do think that there is also much more training for officers today than there was in addressing and thinking about these issues. But we also understand that officers aren't experts in all areas, and that's one reason why we're establishing what we call A3, which is a mental health crisis response network that will eventually be 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. It isn't now, but the Board of Supervisors has allocated significant funding from our Measure X sales tax to fund this new effort where these trained mental health specialists will respond to behavioral health crises in the community instead of or with a police officer. Again, we've had unfortunate cases of police officers in this county as well, but across the country, shooting and killing young adults of color who are experiencing a mental health crisis. And that happened to Miles Hall in Walnut Creek. And we are naming our call center, the A3 call center, to take calls, to dispatch these mental health specialists. We're calling it the Miles Hall Call Center in his honor. In fact, our own district attorney successfully prosecuted a police officer in this county who shot and killed a young adult of color who was experiencing a mental health crisis. And we believe, in fact, it is young men of color who are at greater risk of being harmed by a police officer when experiencing a mental health crisis than a young white male. And we believe that by having a professional behavioral health specialist respond with an officer, or in some cases an officer is not necessary because there's no threat of violence, will save lives. It's the appropriate response. It's the right thing to do. It will help make our community safer, and also it will help the individuals and family members who are involved in this particular crisis. So that's another example, I think, how we've stepped up. We've also, several years ago, worked to eliminate juvenile justice fees and adult justice fees because it was generally African American youth or adults and Latino youth or adults who were harmed by these large fees. And we were one of the first counties to eliminate juvenile justice fees. I was able to testify on a statewide bill that led to the banning of these fees statewide, and we talked about our experience in Contra Costa. And we also banned the fees for adults in the criminal justice system, because what we want to do is when someone has served their time, we want to help them reenter their community successfully and have the best path forward for success. And that's also why we have a reentry success plan. A number of years ago, Supervisor Glover and I led an effort countywide to develop a reentry plan about how the county works with our community partners to create opportunities for individuals who have served their time to successfully reenter their communities. And the Reentry Success Center in Richmond is a great example of that, funded by what we call AB 109 funding.
It's really incredible, John, and you've gone a long way toward putting it together. When you think about the array of proactive, progressive legislation and policies that the Contra Costa County has put together in the last decade to advance equity within our justice system, it really boggles the mind, and it bears repeating. Racial Justice Oversight Body, Office of Racial Equity, equity in eliminating justice fees that are impacting justice-impacted residents, the Miles Hall A3 Center to reduce those kinds of negative and often violent interactions with those who might have mental health crises, the Reentry Success Center, the whole reentry plan, the public health crisis that you declared with the board in 2020, also supporting the first African-American woman DA in Contra Costa County and her progressive policies, advancing language equity across all county communications, and of course the Stand Together program providing immigrant legal resources in order to stave off unwarranted persecution by the federal government. It's incredible, and there's much more. What does it say about this time in history and this place in Contra Costa County that you have been able, with your colleagues, to be successful in advancing this array of legislation?
I attribute a lot of that to the very strong activist base we have in our county that's grown over the years. Residents of every demographic, white, black, Asian, Latino, who live in every part of our county, who've stood up and said, equity is about fighting injustice, fighting racism, fighting discrimination, and they come to our board and they advocate for these policies. And they advocate in their own communities. And so I think that's the voice of Contra Costa and who we are as a county. For example, we recently expanded our Stand Together program to help defend those at risk of deportation, those immigrant families that we don't want to have split up. We started this program several years ago. It's been successful. There's been a greater need for it, so we expanded it to hire more lawyers. And we had so much public support at our board from residents, again, from every part of the county who understand the value of our immigrant families in this county. 25% of our residents in Contra Costa are immigrants. And they contribute to the well-being of our county economically, civically, in all ways. And supporting them is the least we can do. I'm the son of an immigrant. My mom is from Italy. I know how hard she worked when she came to this country, and she impressed on me those values of hard work. And we need to acknowledge that. We need to support these families. And I'm appreciative that at this moment in time, we have so many residents involved in fighting for justice in that way. In fact, they really spoke up and coalesced when our sheriff had a contract with ICE and was housing individuals through ICE who were in the immigration system at our West County jail. And they spoke up, and we successfully urged the sheriff to eliminate that contract and to not house those individuals, because I think it also symbolically represented it caused lack of trust in our immigrant community. If they're seeing in whatever way one of our county departments, in this case the sheriff's department, cooperate with ICE, it made them less apt to go and get county services. So fortunately, the sheriff reached the conclusion that this contract was not the best and eliminated it. So again, it's another example of how hard our community works. And I think, the Trump administration and Trump presidency did inspire, I think, more activism in this county. And I want to acknowledge the hard work of African American and Latino leaders who've been at this for many, many years. I'm not the first to take this issue on. They led this issue. It was their work. In a way, I feel that we're being a voice for all of them to successfully change these policies. And I'm really proud of that here in Contra Costa.
That's wonderful, John. It's so refreshing to see that kind of outlook from an elected leader. And as you're so fond of saying, not me, we, and the residents of Contra Costa County are really incredible and have really stepped up on these issues.
And we have a lot more work to do.
Oh, yeah.
And frankly, we're going to be needing and relying on all of these amazing community leaders and activists to, once we get the office established, the Office of Racial Equity and Social Justice established, we're going to need them to continue to push their work and to support their work. Because this isn't going to come easy. There's going to be resistance to it. In fact, when the report of the community-led effort came to our board, There were people who still did not want to admit that there's institutional racism that exists today. And I think that's the starting place, is we need to acknowledge this isn't something that happens somewhere else. It isn't something that just happened in the past, but it's happening now. And it's impacting people's lives now as we speak. And so we have to start from that place. And we have to all recognize that we're all part of this issue, all part of this problem, and we all need to be part of the solution.
Absolutely. We need to stay energized. And the long arc of history is bending toward justice as long as we remain
Dr.
together.
Martin Luther King said. That's correct. Yes.
Absolutely.
And what also Dr. King said is that really injustice to anyone, anywhere, is an injustice to all of us. And so we can't stand on the sidelines, because if we're on the sidelines, we're part of the problem.
Yeah. Oh, no, very well said. And at the risk, John, of making it about me for just a moment, in this case you, I know that you are always deferential to the public and the people who are helping you lead the way you do in Contra Costa County, but this is personal, this is powerful for you too. John, you have a lot of identities, a lot of hats, so to speak, and one of the biggest ones is John Gioia, anti-racist. You're fighting for this, you're not sitting idly by. One of your heroes is John Lewis, the great civil rights activist and congressman who passed away a few years ago, but was such a huge influence on your life and your public service. Talk a little bit about your background, about why you feel so passionately about issues of equity and anti-racism.
I want to start by first acknowledging the role my father played in some of this. My father was a high school government and history teacher at Kennedy High School in Richmond for many years, and I grew up in Richmond. And he taught me the values and importance of being civically involved to make your community a better place, to fight injustices. And growing up in Richmond, a very diverse community, we understood that we had something special here, that we understood the value of diversity. We understood the value of community made up of different cultures and different ethnicities and races. And I feel fortunate to have grown up here in Richmond, and I think that shapes who I am. And my father shaped my desire and influenced me to be involved. And so when I see that harm, it makes me sad that we're not more advanced and at a better place than we are. And I had a chance to be in Selma, Alabama, and walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge that John Lewis crossed in the 60s during that famous march and protest, and where he was injured. And then later becoming a member of Congress, and said we all need to be involved and to make trouble to improve our society. And being there on that bridge, decades after he was there, was really impactful for me, and thinking about all the hard work that's happened and how we're building on that work by those leaders. And I know our Congressman Mark DeSaulnier has publicly said and has told me that he developed a close friendship with John Lewis. And how serving alongside him was special because of all the things he had done and what he stood for and what he fought for. And so when you're in a place like that and on that bridge, and you transform yourself to that time when people put their lives at risk, their safety at risk, to fight for justice and against racism, it seems what we're doing is easy compared to what they did at that time. And I feel a sense of responsibility on that. And I thank my father for helping develop that sense of responsibility as someone who grew up here in Richmond.
Well, I'm pretty sure that your father is proud, and John Lewis is proud too, because you are definitely a public servant who is always looking to get into good trouble, as John Lewis said. And that's much appreciated, especially on issues like this. With that, is there anything more that you would like to say about what we can do for a more equitable county and society?
I feel optimistic for our future. I think sometimes we can look at what's happening around us and feel negative and feel frustrated that we haven't come farther. But I do see growing movements, and I feel positive about the energy that's out there. And I want to work to harness that energy from great people and make that difference. But we can't fool ourselves and not acknowledge that there are still strong forces working against us to achieve equity and to totally be an anti-racist society. So at times the fight will be difficult, but I ultimately think we'll be successful.
Yep. Contra Costa County Supervisor John Gioia, and also a powerful anti-racist. Thanks so much for being with us today. I'm Robert Rogers. Thank you, Contra Costa County, for joining us for our next episode of Contra Costa Chats.